Welcome back to the Deep Dive. And before we begin today, I want to invite you to just settle in. Find a comfortable position, maybe take a deep breath. Today, we aren't going to be shouting over the noise of the modern world. We aren't going to be rushing through bullet points or, trying to cram for a test. Today, we are stepping into a quiet space. We are going to look back at a moment in time that changed everything, but we're going to do it slowly.
That sounds perfect. History, when you really listen to it, it isn't usually a fast-paced action movie, is it? It's a slow accumulation of decisions, weather patterns, and, well, human emotions.
Exactly. And the topic we are drifting into today is one that everyone knows the name of, but very few people truly know the story of. We are talking about the Battle of Waterloo. Now, usually when you hear the word Waterloo, it's used as a metaphor, isn't it?
It is, yes. In the English language, it's become a synonym for a final, crushing defeat. You might hear someone say, he finally met his Waterloo. It implies a total collapse, an end of the line. But when we look at the source material, the diaries, the logistical reports, the meteorological data, it becomes something so much more complex.
The reality of June 18th, 1815 is so much more than just a synonym for failure. It is a story of a rise and a fall. It is a story about how the fate of an entire continent of millions of lives came down to something as simple and as uncontrollable as the weather.
It really is a remarkable convergence of events. We have the source material here in front of us, historical accounts of the 100 Days, logistical breakdowns of the 7th Coalition, and detailed meteorological reports of that specific summer in Belgium. And what we are going to do is piece this together not as a chaotic war map, but as a human narrative.
So let's start with the central figure, the man at the heart of this storm, Napoleon Bonaparte. The question we need to answer, or at least explore, is simple. How does the Hegemon of Europe, a man considered a military genius, perhaps the greatest since Alexander the Great, lose everything in a single afternoon?
To understand the loss, you have to understand the height from which he fell. I mean, this wasn't just a general losing a battle. This was an emperor losing a world. And the contrast is just... it's so stark. You have a man who, at his peak, redrew the borders of nations with a pen stroke. And by the end of our story, he is confined to a rock in the middle of the ocean.
Let's rewind the clock a little bit. Before we get to the muddy fields of Belgium, we have to look at where Napoleon was just a few months prior. Because he wasn't in Paris. He wasn't leading armies. He was already in exile, wasn't he?
He was. And this is the context that often gets skipped. By 1814, the first anti-French alliance, and this consisted of the heavy hitters like Britain, Prussia, and Austria, had actually managed to defeat him. They marched into Paris, they forced him to abdicate the throne, and they sent him away to a small island in the Mediterranean called Elba.
Elba. It sounds almost pleasant, doesn't it? Like a vacation spot. But for a man like Napoleon, this must have been a cage.
It was a gilded cage, certainly. He was allowed to keep the title of emperor, oddly enough, but he was emperor of a tiny island with a few thousand people. He spent his time reorganizing the island's garbage collection and building roads because his energy just had nowhere else to go. But the alliance made a mistake, a huge mistake. They put him on an island that was far too close to the coast of France.
And you didn't stay there?
No, he didn't. In February 1815, he slips away. He boards a ship and lands on the coast of France with just a handful of guards. And this begins one of the most cinematic sequences in history. He starts walking toward Paris.
This is the part of the story that always feels like a movie script to me. He's walking down the road, and the current king of France, who had been installed by the alliance, sends an entire regiment of soldiers to arrest him. These are men who are ordered to stop Napoleon by force if necessary.
It's the critical moment, the defining moment of his return. You have the 5th Regiment standing across the road, muskets loaded. Napoleon is alone, effectively. He walks out in front of his small group, steps within range of the guns, opens his coat, and says, "If there is any man among you who would kill his emperor, here I am."
And they didn't shoot.
They dropped their weapons. They cheered. They rushed to embrace him. The army that was sent to stop him defected to him on the spot. And as he marched north to Paris, it happened again and again, regiment after regiment. By the time he reached the capital, the king had fled, and Napoleon was carried into the Tuileries Palace by a jubilant crowd. He reclaimed an empire without firing a single shot.
It's incredible. It really is. It speaks to the sheer charisma of the man. But this period, this return, it has a name, doesn't it?
We call it the 100 Days. Because that is roughly how long it lasted. From his return from Elba to his final defeat at Waterloo. It was a brief, intense flicker of a second reign.
But the rest of Europe, the kings and emperors who thought they had finally dealt with him, They must have been absolutely terrified.
Panic is probably the right word. You have to remember, the leaders of the alliance were actually all meeting in Vienna at the time. They were having a conference to decide how to divide up the map of Europe now that Napoleon was gone. They were literally arguing over who got what piece of land. And then a messenger runs in with the news. The monster is loose.
A monster, that's what they called it.
To them, he was. He was the chaos that they had spent decades trying to contain. So they stopped arguing with each other immediately. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, they formed the 7th Anti-French Alliance, and they didn't declare war on France. This is a subtle but important detail. They declared war on Napoleon personally. They declared him an outlaw of humanity.
That sets the stakes incredibly high. It's personal. And the response was massive, wasn't it? We aren't talking about a small skirmish force being sent to deal with him.
No, the mobilization was staggering. If you look at the numbers in our sources, the alliance pledged to put over 1 million soldiers into the field. Their goal was simple: suffocate him, wipe him out for good this time.
And what did Napoleon have? He just walked back into Paris? He didn't have 1 million men waiting for him?
Far from it. France was exhausted. You have to remember, they had been fighting wars for 20 years. Napoleon scrambled to put together an army. He managed to raise the army of the North, which consisted of roughly 70,000 to perhaps 72,000 men.
Just do the math there. 70,000 against a potential million. Well, it sounds impossible.
It is the impossible math of Waterloo. But there's a qualitative difference here, too, that's just as important. The alliance armies were filled with seasoned veterans, disciplined and well-fed. Napoleon's army was a mix. He had his elite old guard, the toughest soldiers in Europe, true. But he also had thousands of hasty new recruits, men who had barely learned to hold a musket. Boys, some of them.
So he's outnumbered, he's outgunned, and the clock is ticking. Because that 1 million men aren't all there yet, right? They are marching from Russia, from Austria. They're still on their way.
Exactly. And that is the absolute key to Napoleon's strategy. He looks at the map and sees that the Russians and Austrians are far away. But sitting just north of him, in Belgium, are 2 armies that are already there. The British, led by the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussians, led by Marshal Blucher.
These are the 2 antagonists of our story. Let's talk about them for a moment. Who is Wellington?
The Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. He is, in many ways, the polar opposite of Napoleon. Napoleon is fiery, aggressive, a gambler. Wellington is the Iron Duke. He is defensive, calculated, cold, and incredibly precise. He chooses his ground, and he holds it. He had never lost a major battle against the French in Spain, and he was known for being unflappable.
And Blucher?
Marshal Blucher is a different character entirely. He was Prussian. He was in his early 70s at this point, an old man by the standards of the day. But he was ferocious. His nickname was Marshal Vorwärts, Marshal Forward. He wasn't a brilliant tactician like Napoleon or a defensive genius like Wellington, but he was aggressive, and he hated Napoleon with a burning personal passion.
So Napoleon has to deal with the defensive genius of Wellington and the aggressive hatred of Blucher. And he has 70,000 men. How does he possibly plan to survive this?
He goes back to his classic playbook. It's a strategy called defeat in detail, or using interior lines. He knows he cannot fight the British and the Prussians if they are together. Combined, they outnumber him 2-to-1. So his only hope is to move so fast that he can get between them.
Divide and conquer.
Precisely. If he can drive a wedge between them, he can turn his whole army against Blucher and crush the Prussians while Wellington is still, putting his boots on. Then, once the Prussians are gone, he can turn around and finish off the British. It's a desperate plan, but it is a brilliant plan. And the terrifying thing for the alliance is, it almost worked.
It did almost work.
Yeah.
Just days before Waterloo, there were other battles, right? He managed to hit the Prussians hard.
He did. On June 16th, that's 2 days before Waterloo, he fought Blucher at a place called Ligny, and he beat him. The Prussians were bloodied and forced to retreat, and Napoleon thought he had knocked them out of the war. He thought, okay, that's 1 down, now I just have to deal with the British.
So the stage is set. The Prussians are retreating, or so Napoleon thinks. He turns his eyes toward Wellington. And Wellington realizes he can't fight Napoleon in the open while the Prussians are gone, so he falls back to a defensible position, a place he'd actually scouted a year before, a ridge near a small village called Waterloo.
And that brings us to the night of June 17th. The armies are settling into position. Napoleon is confident, exceptionally confident. He believes the next day, June 18th, will be a simple matter of breaking the British line and marching to Brussels for lunch.
But then, the sky opens up.
Yes. The weather. It is impossible to overstate how important the weather was on the night of June 17th, 1815. A massive summer storm swept over Belgium. It wasn't just a shower, it was a torrential downpour. Thunder, lightning, rain that fell in sheets all night long.
Imagine being a soldier in that field. You don't have waterproof tents, you're wearing wool uniforms that soak up water like sponges, you are trying to sleep in the mud.
It was miserable. The accounts from the soldiers from all sides describe lying in furrows of plowed earth that had turned into rivers. But for the commanders, this wasn't just about comfort. It was about physics.
The mud factor. We talked about this in the outline. Why is mud such a tactical nightmare for Napoleon specifically?
Two main reasons. First, movement. Napoleon relied on speed. He needed his cavalry, his horses, to be able to charge effectively. Horses cannot gallop in deep, sucking mud. They slip, they break their legs, they get completely exhausted just walking. But the second reason is even more critical. Artillery.
The cannons.
Napoleon began his career as an artillery officer. He famously said, "God fights on the side with the best artillery." His favorite tactic was to line up massive batteries of cannons, what he called the Grand Battery, and pound the enemy line into submission before sending in the infantry.
But you can't roll a cannon through 3 feet of mud.
Exactly. These guns weighed thousands of pounds. In the mud, the wheels just sank up to their axles. And even if you could get them in place, there's the problem of recoil. When a cannon fires, it kicks back violently. If the ground is hard, it rolls back and you can push it forward again quickly. If the ground is soft mud, the cannon buries itself with every single shot. It becomes almost useless.
So the sun comes up on the morning of June 18th. It's a Sunday. The rain has stopped, but the ground is a swamp. Napoleon wakes up. He looks at the field. He wants to attack. He knows time is against him, but he can't.
He consults his artillery officers. They tell him, "Sire, the guns cannot move. The cannonballs will just bury themselves in the mud. We need to wait for the ground to dry."
And so he waits.
He waits. And this is the critical 4 hours mentioned in our notes. This is the pivot point. Napoleon intended to start the battle at 9 a.m., perhaps even earlier, but he didn't launch the main attack until nearly 1:00 p.m.
That's silence.
Yeah.
That 4-hour delay. That is where history turned. Because while Napoleon was waiting for the sun to dry the mud, what was happening elsewhere?
Two crucial things. First, Wellington used every single second of that time to solidify his defenses. He positioned his men behind the ridge, hiding them from view, protecting them from the inevitable artillery barrage. But more importantly, far to the east, the Prussians were moving.
Blucher, the man Napoleon thought was defeated and running away.
Marshal Forward lived up to his name. Despite having been beaten 2 days prior, despite the mud being just as bad for his men, despite his own injuries, Blucher rallied his troops. He told them, "I have promised Wellington I will come. You would not have me break my word." And they began to march through the sludge toward the sound of the impending battle.
So every minute Napoleon waits for the mud to dry is a minute the Prussians get closer to his flank.
Exactly. It's a race against time he doesn't even fully realize he's in. If Napoleon attacks at 9:00 a.m., he very likely breaks Wellington's line before the Prussians can arrive. By waiting until 1:00 p.m., he sealed his fate.
Let's move into the battle itself. It's 1:00 p.m., give or take. The ground is still sticky, but it's passable. The drums start beating. The French columns begin to move.
It begins, and it is chaos in slow motion. The French strategy was brutal and direct. They launched a massive infantry assault against Wellington's center. But Wellington had deployed his men on the reverse slope of the ridge.
Meaning Napoleon couldn't see them.
Right. It was one of Wellington's signature moves. The French artillery fired, but the balls mostly flew over the British heads or thudded harmlessly into the soft, wet mud of the ridge. When the French infantry crested the hill, thinking the way was clear, the British stood up from the grass, fired a devastating volley at close range, and charged with the bayonet. Disordered and surprised, the first French attack completely crumbled.
So the first plunge fails. Napoleon is frustrated. He needs to break this line. And this leads to one of the most controversial moments of the battle, the Great Cavalry Charge.
Yes. This involves Michel Ney. He was known as the bravest of the brave. A redhead, fiery-tempered, and fiercely loyal. Napoleon had left him in tactical command at the center of the field while he managed the big picture.
And Ney sees something, right? Or he thinks he sees something. He thinks the British are retreating.
He sees some British wagons and casualties moving to the rear, probably just the normal churn of battle, clearing the wounded. But Ney mistakes this for a general retreat. He thinks, they are breaking. Now is the time to chase them down. So without waiting for infantry support, without waiting for orders, he orders the cavalry to charge.
This wasn't just a few horses. This was a significant force.
No. It eventually grew into a massive wave. Thousands of French cuirassiers. These are the heavy cavalry with steel breastplates and helmets thundering up the muddy slope. It must have looked like a tidal wave of steel.
But the British weren't retreating.
They were not. When they saw the horses coming, Wellington gave the order and they formed squares.
Describe that for us. What is an infantry square?
It's exactly what it sounds like. The soldiers form a hollow box, maybe 20 men wide on each side, 3 or 4 ranks deep. The front rank kneels, planting the butt of their muskets in the ground with the bayonets pointing out. It creates a wall of spikes. The ranks behind them stand and fire their muskets over their heads.
And horses. Horses won't run into a wall of spikes.
A horse is not a machine. It's a living animal. It will not impale itself on a bayonet. So the French cavalry would thunder up the hill, the ground shaking, looking absolutely terrifying. And then the horses would just swerve around the squares. They would flow around them like water around a rock.
And the British soldiers inside the squares, what was that like?
Terrifying. They just had to hold their nerve. If they broke and ran, the cavalry would cut them down instantly. But as long as they stood shoulder to shoulder, they were relatively safe. The French cavalry circled them, impotent, getting picked off by musket fire from all sides. And Ney led charge after charge. He had 5 horses shot out from under him.
5 horses.
5. He would climb out of the mud, covered in it, grab another horse, and lead the charge again. It was incredibly brave, heroic even. But it was a disaster. He exhausted the French cavalry. He wasted their strength against these immovable rocks of infantry.
Meanwhile, Wellington is riding up and down the line, keeping his men steady.
Wellington was everywhere. He was cool, calm. He would ride into the squares to encourage the men. There's a famous story where a cannonball took off the leg of the man right next to him, and Wellington just kept giving orders without flinching. He knew he just had to hold on. He famously looked at his watch and said, "Give me night or give me Blucher."
And he got Blucher.
Late in the afternoon, looking to the east, Napoleon saw dust clouds on the horizon. At first, he hoped it was his own reinforcement marshal, a man named Grouchy, who he had sent after the Prussians. But as they got closer, the uniforms were dark blue, almost black. They were Prussians.
This is the turning point. The trap snaps shut.
It is the realization of the nightmare. Napoleon is now fighting 2 battles. He has Wellington in front of him, who is still immovable, and now he has Blucher crashing into his right flank. The impossible math we talked about earlier. It has now become a death sentence.
Napoleon has one last card to play, though. The Imperial Guard.
The Old Guard. These were the immortals. His elite of the elite. They had never been defeated in battle. Tall men, huge bearskin hats, veterans of 20 campaigns. When the Old Guard marched, the battle was usually over. Napoleon sent them up the hill toward Wellington as a last desperate gamble.
If they can just break the British line, maybe, just maybe, he can still win before the Prussians fully engage.
The Guard marched up in perfect order. They stepped over the bodies of their comrades. They reached the top of the ridge, and suddenly Wellington gave the order. The British guards, who had been lying down in the cornfields, stood up. They poured a volley of fire directly into the face of the Old Guard. The French wavered. And then, for the first time in history, the cry went out across the battlefield. La garde recule.
The Guard is retreating.
It was the psychological breaking point. If the Guard could not do it, no one could. A panic swept through the French army. Sauve qui peut. Save yourselves. The discipline evaporated. The entire army disintegrated into a mob of running men.
And Napoleon, what does he do in that moment of total collapse?
He tried to rally them. He formed a square with his personal escort, hoping to make a last stand, perhaps to die on the field, but his generals pulled him away. "Sire, you must go." He rode off into the twilight with, according to some accounts, tears streaming down his face, leaving his army and his empire behind in the mud.
The sun sets. The firing slowly stops. The Battle of Waterloo is over. But the cost. We need to talk about the human cost of that one day.
It was horrific. In a space of just a few square miles, nearly 50,000 men and 10,000 horses lay dead or wounded. The French lost roughly 40,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. That's more than half the army just gone. Wellington and Blucher lost over 20,000. Wellington, writing a letter the next day, said, "Nothing except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won."
That is a heavy sentiment. The silence of that field the next morning must have been overwhelming.
And that silence marked the end of an era. The Napoleonic Wars, which had raged for over a decade and cost millions of lives, were finally finished.
So what happened to the emperor? He fled, but he couldn't hide forever.
He returned to Paris, but the political will was gone. The city wouldn't support him. He abdicated for the second and final time. He tried to get passage to America, actually. He wanted to live out his days as a private citizen in the United States. But the British Royal Navy had blockaded all the ports. He had no choice but to surrender to the captain of a British ship, the HMS Bellerophon.
And this time, they weren't going to make the mistake of Elba. They weren't going to give him a nice island near the coast.
No, absolutely not. They sent him to St. Helena. It is one of the most remote places on Earth. A tiny volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from anywhere.
A solitary prison.
The ultimate prison. He lived there for 6 years. He spent his time dictating his memoirs, arguing with the British governor about his rations, gardening, and staring at the empty ocean. He died there in 1821, likely of stomach cancer, at the age of 52.
52. That's so young. He conquered Europe and lost it all by the age of 52.
It really highlights the meteoric nature of his life. He burned very bright and very, very fast.
And Waterloo. The name stuck. It entered the language.
It did. It became legendary instantly. It wasn't just a battle, it was the moment the world reset. It led directly to the Congress of Vienna, which established a balance of power in Europe that prevented a major continent-wide war for almost 100 years, right up until World War I.
And Wellington became a superstar.
The Duke of Waterloo. He became Prime Minister of Great Britain eventually. Statues, street names, the famous beef Wellington dish. His legacy was sealed that day just as firmly as Napoleon's was.
It's fascinating to think about the themes here. We started this deep dive wanting to look at the human story, and what we found was a story about overconfidence.
Hubris. Absolute hubris. Napoleon thought he could beat the math. He thought his genius could overcome the mud, the numbers, the exhaustion of his country. But reality and the rain caught up with him.
And the fragility of it all, that 4-hour delay. I can't get past that. If the sun had been out on the morning of June 18th, the ground would have been hard. The cannons would have fired at 9 a.m. Wellington might have been crushed before noon. Blücher would have arrived to find a defeated British army.
And Napoleon would have marched into Brussels. The map of Europe today would look very, very different. It's a chilling thought. The fate of millions resting on a rainstorm.
It reminds us that no matter how much we plan, no matter how skilled we are, there are forces beyond our control. Nature, timing, luck.
Absolutely. It teaches us a little bit of humility, I think, that even the greatest among us are subject to the whims of chance.
I think that's a perfect place to leave it. A story of a giant brought down by the rain and the mud.
A quiet end to a very loud life.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this story, despite the tragedy of it, helped you settle down. History is full of these moments, complex, human, and ultimately finished. The cannons are silent now. The field of Waterloo is just a field of grass again.
A peaceful place.
We wish you a good rest. Good night.
Good night.